Guam, July 25th, 1944, 3 in the morning. Captain Lewis Wilson is standing on a hill in the rain. He's been shot 3 times tonight. His ammunition is almost gone. Half his men are dead or wounded. Down below, 5,000 Japanese soldiers are coming up the hill again. This is the 6th time tonight. He looks at the men still standing around him. They're looking back at him. He gives one order: fix bayonets. You've heard of Iwo Jima. You've heard of Okinawa. But Guam, the battle where Japan threw everything it had left and lost 18,000 men in 21 days, almost nobody talks about it. And the man who stood on that hill, who held it through 7 attacks in a single night with nothing but a bayonet at the end, you've never heard his name. If your father served in the Pacific, if your grandfather's name is on a roster somewhere that nobody looks at anymore, stay with me. This story was meant for you. Before we get to that hill, there's something you need to understand about Guam. This was not some distant piece of rock in the middle of the Pacific that nobody had heard of. Guam had been American territory since 1898. The people there, the Chamorro people, they were Americans. Their children went to American schools. They spoke English. They flew the American flag. And then came December 8th, 1941. The very next day, after Pearl Harbor, more than 5,000 Japanese troops landed on the island. The American garrison, fewer than 500 men, fought back with everything they had. By December 10th, it was over. The Stars and Stripes came down. What happened next, on that island, to those people? Most Americans never learned about it. The Chamorro people were rounded up and put into prison camps, forced to work for the Japanese military, beaten, tortured, killed. There were villages burned to the ground because someone was suspected of hiding an American. For 2.5 years, that went on. And in all that time, not one Chamorro man or woman betrayed the Americans hiding on that island. Not one. There was a Navy radio man named George Tweed who evaded Japanese patrols for more than 2 years. Families moved him from house to house, from jungle to jungle. They knew what would happen to them if he was found. They did it anyway. That is not the loyalty of people who are forced to fly your flag. That is the loyalty of people who believe in what the flag stands for. If that gets to you the way it gets to me, go ahead and hit the like button right now. Not for the algorithm, because the people of Guam waited 2.5 years for America to come back for them, and most Americans have never heard that story. If you think they deserve to be remembered, that's how you say it. By the spring of 1944, Admiral Nimitz had a decision to make. The island of Guam, American territory, was still in enemy hands. Nimitz assigned the operation to Major General Roy Geiger, a Marine aviator who had been fighting in the Pacific since Guadalcanal, and whose name you will almost certainly not find in any history textbook your children ever read. 65,000 men, 2 landing forces, 1 mission: take back what is ours. On the other side of that island, a Japanese lieutenant general named Takashina Takeshi had been preparing since March. He arrived on Guam from Manchuria with no illusions about what was coming. He knew Japan had lost control of the seas. He knew Japan had lost control of the skies. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June had destroyed what was left of Japan's carrier force. No reinforcements were coming. No air support was coming. Nothing was coming. What Takashina had was 18,000 men, a jungle island, and 1 high piece of ground that looked down over both American landing beaches. Fonte Hill. If the Americans took that hill, it was over. He had one idea, one chance. Get to them before they got to him. Drive them back into the sea before they had time to dig in. One night. Everything he had. He was already planning it before the Americans even left their ships. July 21st, 1944. The American fleet had been offshore for 13 days, pounding the island with everything they had. Battleships, cruisers, carrier aircraft, 13 days of naval and air bombardment before a single man set foot on the beach. And still, the Japanese were waiting. Shortly after 8 in the morning, the first waves of landing craft crossed the line of departure. Hundreds of men in open boats, moving towards the beach. The men inside them had been awake for hours. Some ate. Most didn't. Nobody talked much. When the ramps went down, the first thing many of them hit was the reef. Guam is ringed by coral, sharp, shallow, unforgiving. The boats ground to a stop hundreds of yards from shore. The men had to jump in and wade. Sometimes the water was waist deep. Sometimes it was up to their necks. And the whole time, Japanese machine guns on the hills above the beach were firing down. There was no cover. There was nowhere to go but forward. A sergeant with the 3rd Marines said afterward that the man standing next to him stepped off the ramp and was gone before he even reached the water. He didn't look back. He kept moving toward the beach. That is the only thing you can do. By mid-morning, both landing forces were ashore. The northern force at Asan, the southern force at Agat, miles apart, on opposite sides of the Orote Peninsula. They had made it off the beach, but they were pinned. Narrow strips of sand and rock between the water and the hills. Japanese artillery firing down from above. Every step inland was a fight. Takashina watched from Fonte Hill and did not move his main force. He let them come. The beaches were not where he intended to stop them. The hills were. The deeper they came, the more the terrain worked for him. Ridges, caves, jungle so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. He had learned from what happened on Saipan. Don't fight the Americans at the waterline. Make them earn every yard going up. By the end of that first day, the 2 beachheads were established, but not connected. 7 miles of Japanese-held ground still sat between them. Takashina looked at that gap, and he saw his opening. For the next 4 days, the Marines and Army pushed up those hills. Every ridgeline looked like the last one. Every cave had to be cleared the same way. Flamethrowers, grenades, and then the men going in. There were no clean kills in the jungle. There were no distant targets. It was close. It was loud. It smelled like smoke and wet earth and things you don't put in history books. By July 24th, the 2 beachheads had finally linked up, and the 3rd Marine Division was pushing toward the last high ground on the western side of the island. Fonte Hill, Takashina's command post, the place he had spent 4 months preparing. He called his remaining officers together on the night of July 24th. They had one chance left, not to win the island. That was already gone. But to drive the Americans back into the sea, to buy enough time for something, anything, to change. Tomorrow night. Everything. Brandon, Mississippi. Population, not quite 3,000 people. Louis Wilson grew up there without much of anything. His father, a farmer, died when Louis was 5 years old. His mother raised him through the Depression with help from her family. As a boy, Louis pulled a goat cart through town, selling vegetables door to door. He went to Millsaps College in Jackson on his own money, played football, ran track, graduated in 1941 with a degree in economics. A Marine Corps recruiter came to campus that spring. Wilson signed his name. He was commissioned a second lieutenant in November 1941. 3 weeks later, Pearl Harbor. By February 1943, he was in the Pacific with the 9th Marines, Guadalcanal, Ifat, Bougainville. He was promoted to captain in April 1943. He was 23 years old. By the time Guam came around, he had seen enough to know what war actually was. Not the version in the newspapers, but the version that happens at night in the mud, when nobody is watching. He didn't talk about it much. On the afternoon of July 25th, the order came down to Captain Wilson and Company F. Take your portion of Fonte Hill. He looked up the slope. 300 yards of open ground. No trees, no cover. Japanese machine guns dug in at the top. He didn't wait. He went first. His men followed him up that hill under fire the entire way. He was wounded once on the way up. He kept moving. They took the high ground before sunset. Wilson spent the next 5 hours organizing the defense, moving men into position, placing the guns, walking the line under sniper fire to make sure every gap was covered. He was wounded a second time while doing it. He went back to the aid station, got bandaged, came back, because he knew what was coming down that hill after dark. Takashina had 5,000 men ready to move, and the night belonged to them. There is something about men like Wilson that the history books almost never capture. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought about the man to their left and the man to their right, and what would happen to those men if they weren't standing there. That's the whole calculation. That's all of it. The medal comes later. The hill comes first. Rain came down hard after dark. That was Takashina's last gift from the island. The rain swallowed the sound of 5,000 men moving into position. His soldiers had been drinking sake before they moved out, not to celebrate, to get through the next few hours. The empty bottles were still there in the morning, scattered in the mud in front of the American lines, next to the men who had carried them. Takashina had spent 4 months building this plan. This was not a banzai charge, not the kind of desperate, disorganized rush that had gotten so many Japanese soldiers killed on other islands. This was organized. 6 battalions, multiple attack corridors, coordinated timing. The goal was not to die gloriously. The goal was to break through, reach the beach, and push 65,000 Americans back into the water. Shortly after midnight, orange signal flares went up. The attack began. The first wave was probing, small groups moving along the entire front, feeling for gaps, testing response times, looking for the weak point. The Marines in their foxholes heard them coming through the rain and the dark, heard the sounds that don't have clean names, movement in the brush, voices speaking Japanese, the click of metal on metal. Fingers stayed on triggers all along the line. Then Takashina found what he was looking for. Between 2 Marine battalions, the 3rd Battalion of the 21st Marines and the 1st Battalion of the 9th Marines, there was a gap in the line. 800 yards of ground guarded by a single 25-man reconnaissance unit. 50 Japanese soldiers hit that position at once. The recon unit fought back and was overrun. The gap opened, and through that gap, Japanese soldiers poured into the American rear. They reached the artillery positions. They reached the supply dumps. Some of them got to within yards of a field hospital where American surgeons were still operating. For a stretch of time that nobody wanted to measure afterward, the American lines were broken. Wilson heard the reports coming in. The position to his left was taking heavy fire. The gap had opened somewhere below and behind him. The attack was not coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere at once. He did not pull back. He adjusted his line, tightened the positions he could hold, and sent word down to every man still standing. Hold. The second wave hit Company F directly. This was not probing. This was the main assault. Japanese soldiers coming up the hill in numbers, screaming, in the dark and the rain, into the machine guns and the rifles, and finally into the men themselves. Hand to hand. In the mud. In the dark. Without anything clean or distant about it. Wilson was moving along his line the whole time, not directing from behind, but there, on the position, visible to his men. He was wounded a third time, somewhere in the middle of it. He went to the aid station, got bandaged, came back. The third wave came, then the fourth, then the fifth. By 3 in the morning, 80% of Company F was dead, wounded, or exhausted past the point of moving. The ammunition was almost gone. Wilson looked at what he had left. A handful of men. Empty magazines. The sound of Japanese soldiers regrouping below. The sixth wave had just been turned back. The seventh was coming. He looked at the men still on their feet. They were looking at him. He gave the only order that made sense. Fix bayonets. The seventh wave came up the hill, and the American tanks arrived. One of Wilson's officers had gone down the hill in the darkness to find armor and bring it back. The tanks came up just as the seventh assault began, their guns firing point-blank into the advancing Japanese lines. The wave broke. When the sun came up on July 26th, 3,500 Japanese soldiers were dead in front of the American positions. Company F had killed 350 of them. Fonte Hill was still in American hands. Takashina surveyed what was left of his force in the morning light. The counterattack had failed. The gap his soldiers had broken through during the night had been sealed before dawn. The Americans were still on the hill, still on the island. He ordered a withdrawal to the north. He would fight a different kind of battle now, slow, grinding, cave by cave, inflicting as much cost as possible on the way to the end he already knew was coming. He was still with his men when he gave those orders, not behind them, with them. That did not change. Wilson did not rest when the sun came up. He looked at the slope to the east of his position, a ridgeline still held by Japanese soldiers that threatened everything his regiment had taken. If that ground wasn't cleared, the night's work meant nothing. He gathered 17 men, every man still standing who could carry a rifle. Then he led them up. The Japanese on that ridge had machine guns and mortars. They opened up the moment Wilson's patrol came into the open. 13 of the 17 men went down. Wilson was hit again, his fourth wound in less than 24 hours. 4 men left. He kept going. 4 men took that ridgeline. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cushman, who would go on to become the 25th Commandant of the Marine Corps, wrote about that night and that morning afterward. The defeat of the large counterattack finished the Japanese on Guam. Not slowed them, not set them back, finished them. What Wilson and his company held through 7 attacks in the dark, and what he then took with 4 men in the daylight, was the moment the battle turned. Everything after that was pursuit. General Geiger pushed north. The Japanese had no more organized offensive capability. What was left of Takashina's force, and the 31st Army soldiers under General Obata, who had been stranded on Guam when Saipan fell back into the jungle and the hills of the northern end of the island. They fought from caves. They fought from prepared positions in the dense undergrowth. They fought the way men fight when they have nothing left to fight for, except the ground directly beneath their feet. It cost lives. Every day cost lives. But the outcome was not in question. Not after Fonte Hill. Not after the night of July 25th. On July 28th, 3 days after the counterattack failed, Takashina was overseeing the withdrawal from Fonte Hill when American machine gun fire found him. He died on the same hill he had defended, not in a command post far from the fighting, on the ground, with his men. Whatever else can be said about Takashina, and there is much that cannot be said in his favor, he did not ask his soldiers to go anywhere he was not willing to go himself. General Obata assumed command after Takashina's death. He knew what was coming. On August 11th, with American forces closing in on his last position at Mount Mataguac, he sent a final message to the Emperor. He wrote that Guam was lost. He wrote that his men had fought with bare hands. He wrote that their souls would defend the island to the end. And then, near the close of the message, one line that said everything. I am overwhelmed with sorrow for the families of the many fallen officers and men. Not a report of victory, not a justification. The last words of a commander who knew his men were not going home, and could not stop thinking about the people waiting for them. Then he was gone. On August 10th, 1944, 21 days after the first Americans waded ashore, General Geiger declared Guam secure. 18,377 Japanese soldiers were dead. 1,760 Americans had been killed. The Chamorro people came out of the camps. Many of them had been waiting since 1941 for this moment. Some of them had lost everything while they waited. They came out anyway, and they were standing on American ground again. And then Guam disappeared from the history books. 5 large airfields were built by the Seabees in the months that followed. Nimitz moved his headquarters to the island, to the high ground above Opera Harbor, to Fonte Hill. The hill where Wilson's men held through the night became the nerve center of the entire Pacific campaign. They call it Nimitz Hill now. From those airfields on Guam, B-29 superfortresses took off for Tokyo, for Osaka, for Nagoya, for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Without Guam, none of that happens. Without the night of July 25th, there is no Guam. Without Louis Wilson and the men of Company F, the history of the Pacific War ends differently. Wilson was evacuated to the Naval Hospital in San Diego after the battle. 4 wounds. He stayed until October 16th. In November 1944, he married Jane Clark, his sweetheart from Millsaps College. She was from Pearson, Mississippi. On October 5th, 1945, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck at the White House. 11 other Marines and 3 sailors received the medal that same day. Wilson stood straight. He didn't say much. The following January, his alma mater held a dinner in his honor. They called it Lewis Wilson Day. The room was full. People wanted to hear the hero tell his story. Wilson stood up and said, "I had a good company. They did the work, and I got the credit." And then, "The real heroes of this war cannot receive medals. They lie buried on the beaches of Tarawa and Salerno, of Guam and Normandy." Nobody in that room said anything for a long moment after that. He stayed in the Marines, Korea, Vietnam, decades of service in wars that the country argued about and then tried to forget. In 1975, Louis Wilson became the 26th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, the highest position in the branch. The boy from Brandon who sold vegetables from a goat cart. The captain who held Fonte Hill with a handful of men when the ammunition ran out. He held the top job in the Marine Corps for 4 years. He retired in 1979. When fellow Marines complained that life was hard, he had one response: "Every day in the Marine Corps is like a Sunday on the farm." He died on June 21, 2005, in Birmingham, Alabama. He was 85 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, next to the men he always said deserved it more than he did. History remembers the big names: Nimitz, MacArthur, Eisenhower. Their names are on buildings and ships and textbook chapters. Their faces are on the wall of every military history classroom in the country. But the battles, the real ones, the ones that actually decided things, were decided by men like Louis Wilson. 24 years old, from a small town in Mississippi, son of a farmer who died when he was 5. A boy who learned early that nothing in this life comes easy. Standing on a hill in the rain at 3 in the morning with his ammunition gone, and 5,000 soldiers coming up the slope below him. No photographer was there, no correspondent, no one to record what his face looked like in the moment he gave that order. Just the men beside him, and the hill, and whatever it is inside a person that makes them stay. Guam doesn't have a famous photograph. It doesn't have a Hollywood film. Most Americans couldn't find it on a map. But on the night of July 25th, 1944, on a piece of high ground that an American general later made his headquarters, a captain from Brandon, Mississippi held the line through 7 attacks, with nothing left but a bayonet, and the men who trusted him. That is why you have never had to learn what the Pacific War looked like if Japan had won it. Takashina knew what was at stake that night. That is why he threw everything he had at that hill. Wilson knew it too. That is why he didn't leave it. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If your father served in the Second World War, if your grandfather set foot on one of these islands in the Pacific, or landed on a beach in Europe, or shipped out to Korea before the ink was dry on the peace, chances are he didn't talk about it very much. That generation didn't. They came home, they went back to work, they raised families. And whatever they had seen, whatever they had done, whatever they had lost, most of it stayed inside. But maybe there was one moment, a name he mentioned once and never said again, a sentence he started and didn't finish, a look that crossed his face when a certain song came on the radio or when someone brought up a place he recognized. Half a story. A silence that went on too long. Those stories are not in any history book. They never will be. They live in you. And when you're gone, they go too. Tell me in the comments. What did he say? What did he almost say? What did you hear at that dinner table that you've never read anywhere? Don't let those stories disappear quietly. Put them here. Someone needs to hear them.
February 20th, 1945. Iwo Jima. Day 2. A 4-man fire team moves through a ravine carved into black volcanic rock. The ground gives under their boots like wet ash that cannot decide whether to be solid yet. The air smells of sulfur. Somewhere ahead is a Japanese airstrip. Somewhere behind is a beach where 2,000 Americans died the day before. 11 Japanese soldiers appear from a parallel trench. Both sides open fire at a range close enough to hear the other men breathe. 2 grenades land in the trench, directly in front of the 4 Marines. The man who sees them first has a jammed rifle. He cannot shoot back. He cannot throw them clear in time. He has 1 second, maybe 2. He is 17 years old. He has been in combat for exactly 1 day. He is not supposed to be there at all. The United States Marine Corps spent 2 years trying to keep Jacqueline Harold Lucas out of this war. They had the regulations, they had the paperwork, They had the stockade. They had every rule that has ever been written about who is allowed to fight and who is not. None of it worked. And in that ravine, on the morning of February 20th, with 2 Japanese grenades at his feet and his rifle jammed useless in his hands, Jack Lucas proved why none of it had worked. He chose. Before we go any further, think about the men in your own family who put on a uniform. Your father, your grandfather, your uncle, a neighbor who went and never came back. They were somebody's 17-year-old once. If you have a name like that, a man who served in any branch in any war, put it in the comments right now. Just the name, the branch, where they served. That is how these men stay with us. Jacqueline Harold Lucas was born on Valentine's Day, 1928. Plymouth, North Carolina, a small tobacco town at the edge of the coastal plain. His father, a tobacco farmer, died when Jack was 10 years old. His mother did what mothers in those circumstances did. She enrolled him at Edwards Military Institute in Salemburg, North Carolina, a private military boarding school, uniforms, formations, a daily schedule built around order and obedience to command. It did not produce an obedient boy. It produced something more specific, a boy who understood exactly what military discipline was for, and who decided early that he would apply it entirely to his own purposes. He was big for his age. At 14, he stood 5 feet 8 inches and weighed 180 pounds. He was a cadet captain at Edwards. He boxed, he wrestled, he played football. He was, by every physical measure, not a boy at all. December 7th, 1941. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Jack Lucas was 13 years old. He waited a year. It was the longest waiting he ever did. On August 8th, 1942, he walked away from Edwards Military Institute and hitchhiked to Norfolk, Virginia. He found a Marine Corps recruitment office. He told them he was 17. He forged his mother's signature on the consent form. He bribed a notary to make it official. The recruiters looked at him. They believed what they saw. He was 14 years old. He was in the United States Marine Corps, boot camp at Parris Island, additional training at Camp Lejeune. By late 1943, he was in Hawaii with the 5th Amphibious Corps, assigned to the 6th Base Depot, a logistics unit. He drove trucks on a base while the war happened somewhere else. Then the Marine Corps found out his age, not because of anything dramatic, because of a letter. He was 15 by then, and he wrote to his girlfriend back in Swan Corner, North Carolina, and mentioned something that revealed the truth. Military censors read the letter. They were not pleased. They did not discharge him. The Corps needed the manpower. But they made their decision. He would drive trucks. He would not go to the front. This did not produce in Lucas the resignation it was meant to produce. He applied for combat reassignment. Denied. He applied again. Denied. He started fights with other Marines, enough of them that he ended up before a disciplinary board and spent time in the stockade. He was told that continued behavior of this kind would result in his discharge and return to North Carolina. He continued. He was not discharged. His commanding officer looked at him and made a pragmatic decision. Too capable to lose, they kept him. They still would not send him to the front. He watched it happen from Hawaii. In late 1943, his unit shipped out for Tarawa. He was not allowed to go. He stood on the dock and watched the transport disappear. Tarawa would kill more than 1,000 Marines in 76 hours. The men who came back from it came back changed. Lucas was not there. He was still driving trucks. He applied for combat reassignment again. Denied. He wrote letters requesting transfer to an infantry unit. No reply. He got into more fights. He spent more time in the stockade. He was told that his conduct was making things worse. He did not appear to find this persuasive. A man who has decided something at 14 years old and has not undecided it in 2 years is not a man who is going to be talked out of it by a stockade and a desk assignment. On January 10th, 1945, Lucas walked out of his base in Hawaii. He was wearing a khaki uniform and carrying his dungarees rolled under his arm. He made his way to Pearl Harbor. He found his way aboard the USS Duel, a transport carrying the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, 5th Marine Division toward Iwo Jima. His cousin Samuel Oliver Lucas, assigned to the same ship, helped conceal him. He lived in hiding for 29 days. On February 8th, one day before he would have been listed officially as a deserter, he turned himself in to Captain Robert Dunlap, commanding officer of C Company. Dunlap took him to Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Pollock. Pollock reduced him in rank to private. He assigned him to Dunlap's rifle company as a rifleman. That was the punishment. He was assigned to a combat unit headed for Iwo Jima. He was exactly where he had spent 2 years trying to be. On February 14th, 1945, Jacqueline Lucas turned 17 years old. He was at sea. 5 days later, the ship reached the island. To understand what Jack Lucas walked into, you first need to understand the man who built it. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944. He was 52 years old. He had spent time in the United States during the 1930s, attached to the Japanese embassy in Washington, and later traveling the country on a military observation tour. He had driven across America by car. He had eaten in American homes. He had watched American factories and American workers and American roads. He wrote to his wife from Washington. He told her that America was a vast country of extraordinary industrial capacity, that its people were energetic and practical and difficult to frighten. He wrote to his son from California with instructions about how to fix a draft in the kitchen at home, sending a diagram with measurements, the kind of letter a man writes when he is not sure he will be alive to fix it himself. He had no illusions about what was coming. When he arrived on Iwo Jima, he found a garrison in poor shape. Officers argued over water rationing. Artillery sat exposed in the open. 2 American carrier strikes had already hit the island. Kuribayashi spent 8 months rebuilding everything. He overruled his officers on the fundamental question of how to fight. The traditional Japanese doctrine said, defend the beaches, hold the waterline, die in a banzai charge if the line breaks. Kuribayashi said no. He had seen what American naval gunfire and carrier aircraft did to troops in the open at Saipan and Peleliu. He was not going to repeat it. He ordered his men underground. They dug 18 kilometers of tunnels into the volcanic rock. More than 1,000 rooms and chambers, a labyrinth deep enough that the heat of the bombs on the surface above was felt rather than heard. Positions on the surface were connected to positions underground, connected to positions on the other side of the island. Kill a crew in a pillbox, and a new crew would appear through a tunnel opening 20 minutes later. Positions that looked cleared were not cleared. The island would fight back after it appeared to have been taken. Kuribayashi issued his order to the garrison and required every man to carry a copy. Each man will kill 10 of the enemy before dying. Do not expect to return home alive. He was not the only man on that island who knew the Americans well. Lieutenant Colonel Baron Takeichi Nishi had won the Olympic gold medal in show jumping at the 1932 Los Angeles Games. He had driven convertibles through the streets of Los Angeles. He had attended parties with Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford. Americans had made him an honorary citizen of the city. He spoke English. He knew what Americans ate for breakfast and how they talked about their horses and what they thought of Japan before the war made all of that irrelevant. He brought that knowledge to Iwo Jima as commander of the 26th Tank Regiment. When American forces realized Baron Nishi was on the island, they began broadcasting daily radio appeals directed at him by name. They told him the world could not afford to lose a man like him. They asked him to surrender. They said it was not a disgrace. Nishi never replied. He walked the island in his Hermes riding boots, carrying his favorite crop. He died on or around March 22, 1945, in the final days of fighting. The exact circumstances of his death have never been established. His remains were never recovered. Two men on that island who had spent time in America, who had eaten at American tables and understood American people, who knew better than anyone on the Japanese side what they were facing, and neither of them believed it changed what they had to do. He wrote to his wife in September 1944, months before the first American ship appeared. "It must be destiny that we as a family must face this. Please accept this and stand tall with the children at your side. I will be with you always." He sent her no more letters after that. On February 19, 1945, the American fleet appeared. The bombardment that preceded the landing had been going on for 74 days. When the Marines finally splashed ashore on Red Beach, many of them wondered if there were any Japanese left alive on the island at all. There were. 21,000 of them. Underground, waiting. That night, American Lieutenant General Holland Smith gathered journalists on the deck of his command ship. The Japanese had done something no one had predicted. Not one soldier had charged the beach, not one banzai rush, no mass movement in the open. Smith looked at his reporters and said something that has been quoted in every account of the battle since. "I don't know who he is, but the Japanese general running this show is one smart bastard." The Marines who went ashore the next morning moved through a terrain unlike anything in any training manual. The black volcanic ash gave no solid footing. The ravines twisted and offered no clear sight lines. Grenades were the primary weapon on both sides. Both sides rolled them down slopes and into openings and waited. In the early morning hours of February 20th, Jack Lucas and 3 other Marines from a 4-man fire team were crawling through one of those ravines toward Airstrip No. 1. They spotted a Japanese pillbox and took cover in a trench to avoid being seen. From there, they spotted 11 Japanese soldiers in a parallel trench connected to the pillbox by a tunnel. The Marines opened fire. Lucas hit 2 Japanese soldiers before his rifle jammed. He bent down to clear it. He saw the grenades. There is a category of action that takes less time to happen than it takes to describe. What Jack Lucas did on the morning of February 20th, 1945, took approximately 2 seconds. What it meant has taken 80 years to begin to measure. 2 Japanese grenades on the ground in front of him. Rifle jammed, no time to throw them clear. 3 men beside him with no cover close enough. He shouted a warning. He shoved one Marine out of the way. He threw himself onto the first grenade, driving it into the volcanic ash beneath him with his body weight. He reached out and pulled the second grenade under him. The first grenade exploded. The blast threw him into the air and onto his back. More than 200 pieces of shrapnel entered his body. His right arm, his wrist, his leg, his thigh, his chest. He was barely alive. The second grenade had not exploded. It was still in his left hand. The 3 Marines around him were uninjured. They looked at the shape on the ground and concluded what anyone would conclude. They left him and continued forward. They killed the remaining Japanese soldiers. They pushed through. He was 17 years old. He had been in combat for 1 day. He was lying alone on his back on a volcanic island in the Pacific, holding an unexploded grenade in his left hand. A short time later, a Marine from a different unit passed through the ravine. He saw the shape on the ground. He saw the fingers move. He called for a corpsman. The Navy corpsman who arrived treated Lucas's wounds while simultaneously drawing his sidearm and killing a Japanese soldier who had appeared and was preparing to throw another grenade at the two of them. Other Marines were flagged down. A radio call brought stretcher bearers. They carried Lucas back toward the beach under fire. He had to wait until nightfall to be evacuated. The beach was still being shelled. After dark, he was transferred to the hospital ship USS Samaritan, offshore. He underwent the first of more than 20 surgical operations to remove shrapnel from his body. Not all of it came out. He would carry metal fragments inside him for the rest of his life. He made what every account describes as a surprising recovery. That word, surprising, is carrying an enormous amount of weight. By the time Jack Lucas was being carried to the beach, the battle for Iwo Jima had been going for less than 48 hours. It would last 36 days. Kuribayashi's system worked exactly as he designed it. The Marines paid for every yard. 22,000 Japanese soldiers died on that island. Nearly 7,000 Americans died taking it. The ratio of casualties was unlike anything else in the Pacific War. It was the only major battle in the island campaign where American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese defenders. A Marine officer after the battle said the following: "Let's hope the Japanese don't have any more like him." Kuribayashi himself died on or around March 23, 1945, in the final organized fighting in a gorge in the island's north. His remains were never found, but his words survived. Before the battle, Kuribayashi sent a final transmission to the military headquarters in Tokyo. He wrote that he was sorry they could not have defended the island successfully. He wrote that he believed the enemy would use it to invade Japan proper. He wrote that he found comfort in one thing only: that his officers and men had died without regret, fighting inch by inch against an enemy with overwhelming numbers and equipment. He attached a death poem to the transmission. He wrote, in Japanese, "Arrows and bullets all spent, so sad we fall." He sent it. And then something happened that tells you everything you need to know about the difference between Kuribayashi and the government he served. The Imperial Japanese censors received the poem. They changed one word. They changed sad to mortified. Not sad, mortified. Kuribayashi had written that he was sorrowful for the death of his men. His own government decided the nation could not hear that word from its general. Sorrow was not the approved emotion. The approved emotion was shame at having lost. So they changed it. They sent the altered version to the public. The general's grief was edited into something harder and colder and more useful to the people who had sent him to die on an island they could not defend. Kuribayashi never knew. He was already dead. The censorship of that one word, sad, changed to mortified, is the entire war in miniature. A system that could not afford to let a dying general speak plainly to his own country. A system that needed his grief to be a different emotion than the one he actually felt. Jack Lucas, on the other side of that ravine, was operating in a system that had spent 2 years trying to keep him out and ended up putting his name on a destroyer. The gap between those two outcomes is not explained by weapons or tactics or industrial capacity. It is explained by what each system did with the men who did not fit its expectations. On October 5, 1945, President Harry S. Truman stood on the south lawn of the White House and presented the Medal of Honor to 27 men who had earned it at Iwo Jima. Jack Lucas was among them. Admiral Chester Nimitz was in the audience. So was Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. So was Lucas's mother, who had signed no papers, authorized nothing, whose signature her 14-year-old son had forged 3 years earlier so he could join a war she had not asked him to join. Truman shook Lucas's hand. Jack Lucas was the youngest Marine ever to receive the Medal of Honor, the youngest serviceman of any branch since the Civil War. He went home to North Carolina. He had made a promise to his mother. If he survived, he would finish school. He enrolled in the 9th grade. He was 17 years old. He had more than 200 pieces of metal in his body. He wore the Medal of Honor to his first day of class. He earned a business degree from High Point University. He built a business in Virginia selling beef to distributors near Washington. He married. He had children. He spoke at veterans events for the rest of his life. Then, in 1961, Jacqueline Lucas did something that requires a moment. He was 33 years old. The holder of the nation's highest decoration, 200 shrapnel fragments still in his body from a grenade that had detonated against his chest 16 years earlier. He enlisted in the United States Army as a private and became a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division. He said he did it to conquer his fear of heights. During a training jump, both of his parachutes failed. He survived the fall. He volunteered to serve in Vietnam. The Army declined to send him. He retired in 1965 as a captain at Fort Bragg, training younger men for a war he was not allowed to fight. He was not easy to kill. The record on this point was extensive and consistent. In 1997, when the keel of the USS Iwo Jima was laid, Jack Lucas placed his Medal of Honor citation inside the hull. It was sealed there. It remains there today, inside a ship named for the island where he should have died. He died on June 5, 2008, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Leukemia. He was 80 years old. He was survived by his wife, 4 sons, a daughter, 7 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. In October 2023, the United States Navy commissioned a guided missile destroyer in his name, the USS Jack H. Lucas. His name now moves through water. 2 boys were born in 1928. One was born on Valentine's Day in Plymouth, North Carolina, to a tobacco farmer who would be dead before the boy was old enough to remember him clearly. He grew up large and restless in a small town and decided at 13 years old that he was going to fight in the war, and spent the next 4 years making that decision stick against every obstacle the United States Marine Corps placed in front of him. The other was a young Japanese draftee, a baker, sent to an island he had never heard of to dig tunnels in volcanic rock until the Americans came to kill him. He had a wife at home, a daughter born the previous summer whom he had not yet met. He wrote to his wife asking her to pray for him. He dug. Both of them ended up in the same ravine on the morning of February 20th, 1945. One side threw the grenades, one side absorbed them. This is not a story about good men and bad men. Kuribayashi was not a bad man. He was a man who had lived in America, admired it, and then fought it because his country told him to, and he believed his country's children were worth dying for. The soldiers who threw the grenades were not monsters. They were men in a tunnel who did what the man above them had told them to do. And Jack Lucas was not a hero in the way the word gets used carelessly. He was a boy who had decided something at 14 years old and had not undecided it since. He had no rank that morning worth mentioning. He had no weapon that worked. He had no authority over the situation in front of him beyond the one authority that cannot be issued or revoked. He decided what it required, and he did it. Kuribayashi wrote in his last poem that he was sad. His government changed the word. They could not afford for the men who survived the war to know that their general had grieved for the ones who didn't. Lucas came home and enrolled in the 9th grade with the Medal of Honor around his neck. He did not appear to find this strange. He had made a promise to his mother. He kept it. He moved to the next thing. The war that produced both of these men ended in August 1945. The island they both bled on is still a restricted area today. Civilian access is permitted only for memorial ceremonies. The remains of more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers are still in the ground there, unrecovered. Jack Lucas's Medal of Honor citation is sealed inside the hull of a ship named for that island. It moves through the Pacific on the same water that carried him to Iwo Jima when he was 17 years old, and no one could stop him. The men of that generation settled things at close range, in ravines, in tunnels, with grenades, at a range close enough to hear the other man breathe. Most of their names are not in the textbooks, but they were there, and they chose.
June 18th, 1945. Okinawa. 79 days into the bloodiest land battle of the entire Pacific War. A command jeep rolls up a ridge road in the southern tip of the island and stops at a forward observation post. The man who climbs out is 58 years old. He moves like a man who has been doing this his whole life, because he has. On the front of his steel helmet, 3 stars. Not hidden, not covered. 3 stars, exactly where they always were, visible to anyone on that ridge with a pair of eyes. Including the men dug into the Japanese-held position 300 yards ahead. A signal comes in from a nearby Marine outpost. Urgent. "We can see your stars clearly, sir. So can they." He reads it. He does not move. He stands at the post and watches his Marines push forward on Ibaru Ridge below. This is how he has always led. This is the only way. He knows how. Then a Japanese artillery shell, small caliber, flat trajectory, finds the coral outcropping beside him. The rock shatters. Fragments tear through his chest. The Marines around him get him onto a stretcher and carry him down to the aid station as fast as they can move. He is conscious for a few minutes. Then, he is gone. His son William would say, years later, the first shot killed him. Nobody else was hurt. He was the highest-ranking United States military officer killed by enemy fire in all of World War II. Not the highest-ranking in the Pacific, in the entire war. And most Americans have never heard his name. His name was Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. He built America's fortress at the edge of the world when no one was watching. He led the largest land battle in the history of the Pacific. He won it, and he died 4 days before it was officially over, standing beside his men, with his stars showing, exactly where he always said a commander belonged. This is his story, and it is long past time someone told it. Before you can understand the man, you have to understand the name. Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. That name did not arrive clean. It came with weight. It came with history. It came with a shadow that would follow him every single day of his 37 years in uniform. He was born on July 18, 1886, at the family estate called Glen Lily, outside Munfordville, Kentucky. He was the only child of his father's second marriage. His father was 62 years old the day he was born. His mother was 28. The old man had already lived an entire life before this boy drew his first breath. And what a life it was. Simon Bolivar Buckner, Sr. was a Confederate lieutenant general in the Civil War. But that title alone does not tell you what you need to know. Here is what you need to know. In February of 1862, at Fort Donelson, Tennessee, the Confederate position became untenable. 2 of Buckner Sr.'s fellow commanders, Generals Floyd and Pillow, looked at what was coming, handed command to Buckner, and slipped away in the night. They left him holding the bag. Buckner Sr. stayed. He sent a note to the Union commander across the lines, a man he had known since West Point, a man he had once lent money to when that man was broke and far from home. and he asked for surrender terms. The Union commander wrote back 4 words that would be printed on the front page of every newspaper in America. No terms except an unconditional surrender. The man who wrote those words was Ulysses S. Grant. The man who accepted them was Simon Bolivar Buckner, Sr. He became the first Confederate general to surrender an entire army in the Civil War. He spent 5 months as a prisoner of war. When the war ended, he rebuilt his life. He became governor of Kentucky. In 1896, he ran for Vice President of the United States on the gold Democratic ticket. He lived to the age of 91. And when Ulysses S. Grant died, Buckner Sr. was one of the pallbearers at his funeral, standing alongside the men who had once been his enemies, carrying the casket of the man who had demanded his unconditional surrender. That is the father. Now imagine growing up as that man's son. In Kentucky, the Buckner name meant honor, sacrifice, and a war that people in that part of the country did not consider entirely lost. Not in their hearts anyway. In the North, it meant the other side. In the army that young Simon would eventually join, it meant something more complicated still. A question mark that followed him into every room, every promotion board, every command decision. Is he one of us, or is he his father's son? In 1904, when young Simon was 17, his father did something that tells you exactly what kind of man the senior Buckner was. He wrote a personal letter to President Theodore Roosevelt and asked him to appoint his son to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Roosevelt said yes. 4 years later, Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. graduated. He ranked 57th out of 107 cadets. Not at the top, not a prodigy, not the kind of young officer who makes the brass stop and take notice on day 1. 57th out of 107. A man who was going to have to earn every single thing that came after. And that is exactly what he did. For the next 30 years, Buckner built a career in the only currency that cannot be faked and cannot be inherited: work. Infantry postings, 2 tours in the Philippines, instructor at West Point, student at the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, back to West Point as Commandant of Cadets in the early 1930s. 17 years, from 1919 to 1936, in which he never once commanded troops in combat. He spent those years in classrooms, on training fields, in the grinding institutional work of making soldiers out of young men who did not yet know what they were. One cadet's parent, describing Buckner's tenure as Commandant, put it this way: "Buckner forgets that cadets are born, not quarried." He took that as a compliment. He was not a soft man. He slept under a single sheet, no matter how cold the quarters got. He told his men they were not allowed to use underarm deodorant. His reasoning, delivered without apology and without humor: a man should smell like a man. You can laugh at that if you want. But understand what it meant. It meant that Simon Buckner had decided, somewhere early in his life, that a commander has no right to any comfort that his men cannot share. Not a warmer blanket, not a softer bunk, not a bar of scented soap. If his men were cold, he was cold. If his men were uncomfortable, he was uncomfortable. That was not a policy. That was a philosophy. And it ran bone deep in the man. By 1940, Buckner was 53 years old. He had just been promoted to brigadier general. He had spent his entire adult life in service to a country that was not entirely sure, for most of that time, whether to fully trust a man with his name. He had given it everything, anyway. And now Washington had an assignment for him. It was not the kind of assignment that ambitious officers competed over. It was not the European theater. It was not the Central Pacific. It was not anywhere near the front page of any newspaper in America. They sent him to Alaska. He packed his things and went. No complaint on the record. No protest. No request for reconsideration. He went the way he always went. Head down. Eyes forward. Ready to work. That, too, was the point. That had always been the point. Most Americans who know the name Okinawa have never heard the name Attu, and almost none of them know that before Okinawa, before the 10th Army, before any of the battles that made the history books, Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. spent 4 years in a place nobody was watching, building something that kept the entire western coast of the United States from being within range of Japanese bombers. Washington called it a sideshow. History has mostly forgotten it ever happened. Buckner just called it his job. Alaska in 1940 was not a state. It was a territory, and from a military standpoint it was almost completely bare. No paved roads through the interior, no airfields capable of handling modern combat aircraft, no supply lines worth the name, no coastal fortifications. 6,000 miles of coastline with almost nothing behind it. The Army had been aware of this problem for years. Nobody had done much about it. Now, it was Buckner's problem. He arrived in Anchorage in the fall of 1940 with a small staff, a tight budget, and orders that amounted to fix it. Washington was staring at Hitler. London was burning. The newspapers were full of France, of the Atlantic, of everything happening on the other side of the world. Nobody in any newsroom in America was thinking about Alaska. The first thing he did was get cold. He took every piece of equipment his men would eventually be issued: the boots, the sleeping bags, the winter parkas, the gloves, and he went outside and used them. Not in a testing facility. Not in a write-up submitted by someone else. He put on the boots and walked in them until they failed or they didn't. He slept in the sleeping bags in the actual Alaskan cold until he knew what they were worth and what they weren't. According to records from the Alaska History Archives, Buckner spent significant time in the field personally for exactly this reason, because he had already decided long before Alaska, that he would never order a man to endure something he had not endured himself. What he found, he revised. What failed the standard, he replaced. What worked, he kept. Then he built everything else. Roads went into terrain that Army engineers had already marked as impassable. Airfields appeared on coastlines where there had been nothing but rock and fog. Supply depots, coastal defense positions, and the military port of Whittier, connected to the rail network by a tunnel blasted straight through solid rock, a tunnel that Alaskans still drive through today. Out of wilderness, out of permafrost and frozen tundra, and the kind of weather that kills men who aren't paying attention. Buckner built a fortress. His men had a name for him. They called him the Silver Stallion of Alaska. Then came June 3rd, 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan hit Dutch Harbor. It was the only enemy air assault on American territory since the attack on Pearl Harbor itself. And this time, the base was ready. Anti-aircraft batteries opened up the moment the Japanese aircraft crossed the horizon. Army P-40 fighters scrambled off a runway that the Japanese didn't know existed. A secret airfield Buckner had ordered built and kept quiet. The attackers were met in the air. They lost planes. The base held. Unlike Pearl Harbor, the man in charge had seen it coming and done something about it. But the attack on Dutch Harbor was not the worst of what happened that week. Days later, Japanese forces came ashore on Kiska and Attu, two small islands at the far western end of the Aleutian chain. American soil, occupied by a foreign enemy for the first time since the War of 1812. Let that settle for a moment. Japanese soldiers, on American ground, raising their flag on United States territory. The mainland barely noticed. The newspapers were full of Guadalcanal, of North Africa, of Stalingrad. Alaska was a footnote at the bottom of a page most readers skipped. But those were American islands, and Simon Buckner was going to take them back. He pushed Washington for what he needed, not once, repeatedly, persistently. The way a man pushes when he understands that the bureaucracy will outlast the patient, but not the stubborn. He asked for men. He asked for ships. He asked for the aircraft and the supply lines and the amphibious equipment that a campaign in the North Pacific was going to require. He kept asking until he got enough to work with. May 11th, 1943. Operation Land Crab, the assault on Attu Island, the only land battle of the Second World War fought on American soil. The men who hit those beaches were soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division. They had spent months training in the California desert, training for North Africa. When the strategic picture changed and their orders changed with it, nobody thought to change what was loaded onto their transport ships. Cold weather gear was sitting in a warehouse somewhere. The Army had decided the Pacific did not require it. The Army was wrong. Temperatures on Attu rarely climbed above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The fog came in so thick that men 10 yards apart could lose each other completely. The ground was not ground. It was tundra, deep and soft, that swallowed boots and pulled at every step. Men who had been sweating through drills at Fort Ord in California were now clawing up frozen ridgelines in the same uniforms they had worn in the desert. Frostbite casualties ran into the thousands, alongside the men wounded in actual combat. They fought anyway, 19 days, ridge by ridge. The Japanese garrison on Attu numbered approximately 2,900 men. They had been ordered to hold. They understood what that order meant. On May 29th, after 19 days of fighting, with their ammunition nearly gone and their position broken, the Japanese survivors launched a final charge, a last full effort straight into the American lines. When it was over, 28 men from that garrison were taken prisoner. 28 out of 2,900. Attu was American again. On Kiska, the next island over, the Japanese garrison had watched what happened on Attu. Under the cover of fog, they slipped away before the American invasion force arrived. By August of 1943, every inch of American territory in the Aleutians had been reclaimed. Buckner's statement after the campaign was not what you would call a victory speech. It was something else. He said, "The loyal courage, vigorous energy, and determined fortitude of our armed forces in Alaska, on land, in the air and on the water, have turned back the tide of Japanese invasion, ejected the enemy from our shores, and made a fortress of our last frontier. But this is only the beginning. We have opened the road to Tokyo, the shortest, most direct, and most devastating to our enemies." That is not a man celebrating. That is a man pointing at what comes next. There was no front page, no ticker-tape parade down Fifth Avenue. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. Then he went back to work. By June of 1944, the Aleutian Campaign was finished. Alaska was secure, Buckner had done precisely what he had been sent to do. He was 57 years old. He had spent 4 years at the edge of the world, in a theater of war that most of the country couldn't have found on a map. He had built a military command from nothing. He had defended American territory when it was invaded. He had taken it back. He had never been ordered into a major ground battle. He could, at that point, have finished out the war right where he was, honored, comfortable, safe. Alaska already loved him. He had even bought land there, a home site on a bluff overlooking Nick Arm, outside Anchorage, and a farm down in Homer. He planned to come back after the war and stay for the rest of his life. But the war was not over, and Simon Buckner could not make himself finish something that wasn't finished. He submitted a formal request for transfer to an active combat theater. There is a specific kind of man who, having already proven himself beyond any reasonable doubt, looks at what he has built and decides it is not enough. Not because he is reckless, not because he is chasing a medal or a headline or one more line in a service record, but because he has been a soldier his entire adult life. And he cannot imagine finishing that life anywhere other than where the fighting is. Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. was 57 years old when he asked to go back to war. He had already saved the American West Coast. He wanted to finish the job. That is not ambition. That is character. Mayor, before we get to Okinawa, if this story is hitting you the way I think it is, take a second and hit the like button. Not as a reflex, because General Buckner spent 4 years doing one of the most consequential jobs of the entire Pacific War, and almost no one has ever sat down and told this story properly before. The like helps more people find it, and this story deserves to be found. All right, Okinawa. In July of 1944, Buckner received new orders. Report to Hawaii. His assignment: build an army, not reorganize one, not take command of one already standing. Build it, from the ground up, out of Army and Marine Corps units that had never fought together under a single command, in a joint structure that the American military was still figuring out how to make work. He had 8 months. The original plan was Taiwan. Operation Causeway, a massive amphibious assault on a large, heavily defended island that would have taken months and cost enormously. Washington looked at the numbers, looked at the calendar, and changed the plan. The target became Okinawa. Codename: Operation Iceberg. Okinawa is 60 miles long. It sits approximately 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. Whoever holds Okinawa holds the airfields and the anchorages needed to launch an invasion of Japan itself. American military planners at the time were looking at casualty projections for a full invasion of the Japanese mainland that ran into the hundreds of thousands, some estimates higher than that. Okinawa was the last major objective standing between the Pacific War as it was and what it might yet become. Buckner understood exactly what he was being asked to do. He trained his men accordingly. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The 10th Army hit the beaches of Okinawa in the largest amphibious assault in the history of the Pacific Theater. Approximately 180,000 assault troops, more than 1,500 ships, the full accumulated weight of American industrial power and American military will, pointed at a single island. The first hours went better than anyone expected. The beaches came in light. Soldiers and Marines moved inland with less resistance than the planners had prepared for. For a brief moment, some men dared to think this might be shorter than feared. Then they turned south, and they found what was waiting for them. General Mitsuru Ushijima had not defended the beaches. He had let the Americans land. He had pulled his forces back into the southern portion of the island, into a network of caves and tunnels and concrete bunkers and hardened ridgeline positions that months of preparation had turned into the most formidable defensive system the Americans had yet encountered in the Pacific. Ushijima's strategy was deliberate. He could not win on the beaches, but he could make the Americans pay for every yard of ground after them. One American position became known as Death Valley. Another was called Purple Heart Ridge. The names tell you what the fighting was like. What followed was 82 days of close-quarters combat. Cave by cave, bunker by bunker, ridge by ridge, in rain that turned the ground into mud that swallowed men to the knee, in heat that made the dead impossible to leave where they fell. 82 days in which American soldiers and Marines advanced because they refused to stop advancing, and for no other reason. Through all of it, Buckner was present, not in a headquarters tent 50 miles back, not reading dispatches from a comfortable command post, at regimental observation posts, at battalion forward positions, in places where the sound of the fighting was not a distant rumble, but something immediate and close, because he had made a decision, somewhere early in his life, that a commanding general has no right to be anywhere other than where his men are. The Marines had developed a particular unease about his visits to the front. There was a pattern to them. The enemy, more than once, had opened fire shortly after the general arrived. A 3-star command flag on a jeep in a forward area was not what anyone would call inconspicuous. His men knew this. Buckner knew they knew it. He came anyway. Late May. Marines from Company A, 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, a unit that had taken to calling itself the Rebel Company, fought their way into the ruins of Shuri Castle. Shuri Castle was the symbolic center of Japanese power on Okinawa. Taking it meant the back of the defense was broken. The company commander, Captain Julian Dusenberry of South Carolina, had no American flag with him. So he raised the only flag he had, a small Confederate battle flag he had been carrying, folded in his helmet since he left home. It flew over Shuri Castle for 2 or 3 days. When Buckner heard about it, he ordered it taken down, immediately. His words recorded at the time. Americans from all over are involved in this battle. That is all he said. No speech, no explanation, no ceremony around it. He gave the order and moved on. Stop and consider who gave that order. The son of Simon Bolivar Buckner Sr., the Confederate lieutenant general who surrendered to Grant at Fort Donelson, who served as governor of Kentucky, whose shadow had followed his son into every room and every command for 37 years. That man's son ordered the Confederate flag down from a captured Japanese castle in the middle of the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, without hesitation, because there was only one flag that belonged on that castle, and he knew exactly which one it was. There is a whole life in that order, a whole career, a whole answer to every question anyone had ever quietly asked about whose side he was really on. By the middle of June, the battle was entering its final phase. Ushijima's forces were compressed into the southernmost tip of the island. Organized resistance was collapsing, sector by sector. The end was visible. He was 4 days from it. June 18th, 1945. You already know how this day ends. You heard it at the beginning of this story. But now you know who the man was when the jeep pulled up to that ridge. Now it means something different. Buckner came to a forward observation post in the southern end of the island. His command jeep outside, flying the 3-star standard, visible to anyone on the road. The 8th Marine Regiment was advancing on Ibaru Ridge below. He had come to watch the final push, the same way he had watched every push on every ridge across the entire length of the campaign. The Marines at the observation post had seen this before. They knew the pattern. A signal went out from a nearby outpost, urgent. They could see his 3 stars clearly from where they stood, which meant the Japanese, with observation posts still active on the ridge opposite, could see them too. Buckner got the word, and he did something that one account from the period describes this way. He took off the starred helmet and replaced it with an unmarked one. For a moment. Then the stars went back on. Whether that was an oversight or a decision is something only he knew. But anyone who had watched him lead for the previous 37 years could make a reasonable guess. The shell was small, estimated 47mm caliber, flat trajectory. It found the coral outcropping beside him, and the rock shattered. The fragments went into his chest. The Marines around him moved fast. Stretcher. Aid station. He was conscious for a short time. Then he was gone. He died at the aid station. He never made it to surgery, his son William, years later. The first shot killed him. Nobody else was hurt. He was 58 years old. 4 days later, General Ushijima committed suicide rather than surrender. The last organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa was crushed. The battle that Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. had planned in Hawaii, trained for through 8 months of work, and led across 82 days on that island, won. He just wasn't alive to see it. Command passed to Marine General Roy Geiger, the only time in American military history that a Marine general commanded a field army. Nakagasuku Bay, on the east side of the island, was renamed. They called it Buckner Bay. American military personnel still use that name in official correspondence today. A memorial stands on the hill where he fell, near Itaman City. Fort Buckner still stands on Okinawa. 9 years after his death, the United States Congress passed a special act posthumously promoting Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. to the rank of full 4-star general. He died a 3-star general. Congress gave him the 4th star when it could no longer matter to him personally, but it mattered to his family. And it mattered to the record. His son Bill spent years compiling his father's wartime writings. They were published as 10th Army Commander, the World War II Diary of Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. Bill also kept a letter from General George Patton, a close personal friend of his father's. Part of it read, "Anything you can do about this would be greatly appreciated. I will reciprocate. Signed, George Patton." The bay carries his name. The fort carries his name. The memorial marks the hill where he fell. Those things are still there. It is his name in the history books that went quiet. There is one detail about Simon Buckner that never makes it into any account of his life. It is small, but it is the detail that stays with me. After the Aleutian campaign ended, after Attu was won, after Kiska was clear, after the work in Alaska was finished, Buckner bought land, a home site on a bluff overlooking Nick Arm outside Anchorage, a farm down in Homer. He planned to come back after the war and live there. Alaska had been his assignment. It had become his home. He never returned to it. He went to Hawaii instead, then to Okinawa, and on June 18th, 1945, he died on a ridge 300 yards from the front line, watching his men finish the work he had started. 4. Historian James Hallis, writing about the Okinawa campaign, noted that Buckner was respected by his men precisely because he never seemed to calculate the personal cost of being where he was. He did not die because he was careless. He did not die because he forgot he was a target. He died because he had decided, across 58 years of living and 37 years of service, that being a target was part of the job. The highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in all of World War II. A 4-star general by act of Congress 9 years after his death. A bay in Okinawa that still carries his name in official military correspondence to this day. He refused to hide. Japan killed him for it. America forgot him anyway. But not today. I want to close with something that has nothing to do with history books. There are families in this country, and maybe yours is one of them, where there is a photograph in a drawer somewhere, or sitting on a shelf, or tucked into the back of an old album. A man in uniform, young, serious, looking at the camera the way men looked at cameras when they didn't yet know if they were coming home. Maybe your grandfather fought in the Pacific. Maybe he came back and sat down at the dinner table one night and never talked about it again. Not at Thanksgiving, not at Christmas, not even when you were finally old enough to ask, and you did ask, and he looked at you for a moment, and then looked away. Some of those men went quiet when the war ended and stayed quiet for the rest of their lives. Not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much. Those quiet men carried stories that will never appear in any book. The name of a man they lost on a ridge that nobody remembers. Something that happened the night before a landing that no correspondent was there to record. The joke somebody made that kept an entire unit from coming apart. If you grew up at a table where one of those stories was told, even once, even just a piece of one, even something you half remember from a Sunday dinner 30 years ago, write it in the comments. Even a sentence, even a name. Because stories like General Buckner's survive only because someone, at some point, decided they were worth keeping. Your family's story is worth keeping too. Don't let it disappear. He named his plane after his wife. 4 times. Same name. 4 different aircraft. Fiery Ginger. Fiery Ginger 2. Fiery Ginger 3. And finally, Fiery Ginger 4. The one he took off in on the afternoon of March 5th, 1944. The one he didn't bring home. 5 months before that afternoon, this man flew 4 P-47 Thunderbolts into a sky above New Guinea that Japan believed it controlled. His reconnaissance mission was already done. His fuel gauges were reading low. Between his 4 aircraft and the nearest friendly base, there were more than 40 Japanese fighters in the air. He gave the signal to attack. When those 4 Thunderbolts turned south toward home, 6 Japanese aircraft were falling toward the jungle below. Not one American had been touched. The sky above Wewak belonged to him. He went back. This is the story of a general who built a trap out of dust and grass huts, and a pilot from Texas who proved that a plane every expert had written off could clear the sky over New Guinea. If you've never heard the name Neil Kirby, that's not an accident. History tends to remember battles by what they cost. This one was designed too well to be famous. And the man at the center of it kept flying long after anyone could justify letting him. By the summer of 1943, the north coast of New Guinea was where the Pacific War was being decided, and not in America's favor. Japan had built something at a place called Wewak. 4 airfields, Batebaram, Dagwa, and Wewak proper. 4 airfields spread across a stretch of coastline where the Owen Stanley Mountains came down to meet the sea, and the jungle ran in every direction as far as you could see from the air. Lieutenant General Kumaichi Teramoto had moved the Japanese 4th Air Army there in force. 200 aircraft, everything from state-of-the-art Ki-43 fighters to twin-engine bombers. Every Allied ground advance that Douglas MacArthur was planning, up the coast toward the Philippines, had to pass within range of what Teramoto had assembled at Wewak. He had positioned those aircraft there for a reason. Wewak sat beyond the reach of the longest-range escort fighter the Allies had in the theater. Whatever MacArthur sent up that coast, Teramoto could hit it from Wewak. Whatever Kenny sent to Wewak, it would have to go unescorted. The distance from Wewak to the nearest Allied fighter base at Port Moresby was roughly 400 miles. That number was the whole problem. A P-38 Lightning, the best escort fighter George Kenny had, could manage a round trip of about 1,000 miles on its tanks. Port Moresby to Wewak and back was right at that limit, and that assumed no combat, no detours, no headwind. In practice, it was beyond range, and heavy bombers sent to Wewak without escort would fly straight into 200 Japanese aircraft waiting at altitude. Kenny had run that calculation. He knew what the answer was. The answer was, don't go, which meant Teramoto could build whatever he wanted at Wewak, reinforce however he chose, and launch from there against anything MacArthur moved up the coast. He was 400 miles from trouble. He had 200 aircraft. He had time. George Kenny didn't accept that situation. Kenny was not the kind of general who worked from the answer backward. He was the kind who started with the constraint and asked what would have to be true for the constraint to stop being true. The constraint was range. What would have to be true for his fighters to reach Wewak? They would need a base 200 miles closer than Port Moresby. A base somewhere in the Owen Stanley Mountains, close enough to shorten the round trip. Far enough from the coast that Japanese ground forces couldn't reach it. His scouts found what they were looking for in the mountains south of Leh, an abandoned pre-war airstrip near a village called Marilinan. Rough ground, no infrastructure, no roads in or out, surrounded by jungle. But the elevation was right, the length was workable, and if American engineers could build a runway there fast enough and quietly enough, it would put fighters within escort range of Wewak for the first time. Quietly was the problem. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew that coast regularly. Any construction activity in the mountains would be spotted. Any sign of a new Allied airfield being built would bring the 4th Air Army down on it before the first P-38 landed. Kenny's solution was to give them something else to look at. 2 dummy airfields went up near Japanese infantry positions on the Huon Peninsula, north of Leh. Small construction crews, vehicles driving in slow circles to raise dust clouds that read, "From the air," like grading activity. Grass huts arranged in patterns that suggested barracks, worn tracks leading nowhere. The appearance, from altitude, of serious military construction underway. The Japanese 4th Air Army responded exactly as Kenny had calculated. Raid after raid came down on those ghost fields. Bomb after bomb went into craters that were already there. Pilots returned to Wewak with bomb damage assessments showing runways destroyed, structures burning. Mission accomplished. The threat was being suppressed. Meanwhile, Australian infantry had established a perimeter around Marilinan, while U.S. Army engineers went to work in tropical heat, with equipment flown in piece by piece. There were no roads, so every generator, every load of gravel, every fuel drum came in by air transport. The men building that runway knew what it was for. They worked like it. C-47s landed on the rough strip as soon as it was long enough to take them, unloaded, and went back for more. The airstrip took shape through July 1943. By late July, the first P-38s touched down on a runway the Japanese did not know existed. The deception held longer than Kenny had any right to expect. On August 12th, the 4th Air Army launched a series of raids on Allied bases at Mount Hagen, Bena Bena, Wau, and Salamaua. Real targets, real damage. Teramoto's aircraft were hitting Allied airfields now, which meant the construction effort was beginning to register as a threat. But the specific target that mattered, the one that would have told Teramoto what was actually being prepared, they never found. Teramoto's 200 aircraft sat at Wewak, wingtip to wingtip on 4 airfields, no radar, no advance warning system beyond human lookouts posted at the perimeter, men who could see the sky directly above them, and nothing more. No shelters adequate to protect more than a fraction of the aircraft on the ground. The Japanese air defense at Wewak had been designed around one assumption, that if the Americans came, they would come from altitude. Heavy bombers in formation, high up, with anti-aircraft guns below trained to reach them. That assumption was about to cost them everything. August 17th, 1943. Between 9 in the evening and midnight, 50 heavy bombers lifted off from Port Moresby and the surrounding fields. B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses. They climbed out into the dark sky over the Owen Stanley Mountains and turned north. 3 hours of flying over open water and coastline, in the dark, navigating by dead reckoning toward 4 airfields they had never approached from this direction before. They arrived over Wewak before the sun came up. At Borum Airfield, when the bombs began to fall, 60 Japanese aircraft were sitting on the runway with their engines warming. Crews were aboard. The day's operations were about to begin. Some of those crews tried to get their aircraft airborne. The runway was already being destroyed beneath them. The survivors scattered into the jungle. At 9 o'clock the next morning, the second wave arrived. More than 30 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, escorted by more than 80 P-38 Lightnings flying out of Marilenan, the base that did not exist until 5 weeks ago, came in over the tree line at 30 to 50 feet above the ground. This was the same low-level technique that had broken the Bismarck Sea convoy 5 months earlier, pushed further and applied at larger scale. The B-25s had been modified with guns packed into the nose, 8, 10, sometimes 12 forward-firing machine guns, turning the aircraft into something that functioned less like a bomber and more like a flying weapons platform. Underneath the bomb bay, clusters of parafrag bombs on honeycomb racks. Each parafrag had a small parachute attached. The chute slowed the fall just long enough for the attacking aircraft to clear the blast radius before detonation. Kenny described later what his crews saw when they came over the tree line at Borum. 60 Japanese bombers, lined up on either side of the runway, engines still turning, nowhere to go. Every Japanese anti-aircraft gun at Wewak was designed to depress no lower than a certain angle. The threat came from altitude. That was doctrine. That was training. That was years of operational experience built around a specific picture of how air attack worked. The B-25s came in below the depression limit of the guns. Below the level the lookouts were watching. Below the sight lines of the men in the towers, coming from the direction of the ground rather than the sky, at a speed that gave the men on the runway approximately 2 seconds between first awareness and impact. There was no effective response. On August 18th, 62 more B-25s hit Wewak and Borum again. Delayed action bombs went into the runway surfaces. Aircraft that survived the strafing found themselves sitting on craters they couldn't taxi around. 2 more raids followed on August 20th and 21st. On the final day, the P-38s from Marilenan met Japanese fighters trying to rise in defense and shot down half of what managed to get airborne. When it was over, the 4th Air Army tallied its own losses. Out of 200 aircraft present across the 4 Wewak area airfields, 54 shot down in the air, 16 blown up on the ground, 57 badly damaged, 47 slightly damaged. Total, 174 aircraft out of 200 put out of action in 5 days. Operational strength of the 4th Air Army, approximately 30 aircraft. Allied losses across all 5 days of attacks, 10 aircraft. The Japanese officer who would later try to explain what happened, Colonel Kazuo Tanikawa, a staff officer at 8th Area Army, said simply that their defenses were not ready. The visual warning system gave the crews no time. The aircraft were parked too close together. Everything at Wewak had been built to stop a threat that came from above. The threat had come from somewhere else. Within weeks of those 5 days, pilots in Kenny's command had started using a new word. It came from them, not from any headquarters directive. When a low-level strafing and parafrag attack destroyed a Japanese airfield, they called it "we-waking," a noun that became a verb, a place name that became a method. That is one measure of how complete it was. Now you need to know about a man named Neil Kirby. He was born in Wichita Falls, Texas, in 1911. Grew up there, then in Mineral Wells, then in Arlington, where his father set up a dental practice when Neil was 13. He graduated from Arlington High School in 1928, put himself through North Texas Agricultural College, worked for 3 years in Dallas to save money, then went back to school at the University of Texas at Austin to finish a business degree. In 1937, the year he got that diploma, he walked into an Army Air Corps recruiting office. He was 26 years old. He had a business degree, no family connections in the military, and one specific idea: he wanted to fly. He learned at Randolph Field in San Antonio. That is where he met Virginia King Cochran. They married. They would eventually have 3 sons, Robert, John, and Kenneth. In June 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby arrived in Australia with the 348th Fighter Group. He was 32 years old. He was flying P-47 Thunderbolts. In the 5th Air Force's Pacific Theater, that last fact was a problem. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a heavy aircraft, wide, built around a massive radial engine, with a fuselage wide enough that pilots made jokes about it. The P-38 Lightning had been the premier fighter in the Southwest Pacific for close to a year. Its pilots looked at the P-47 with something between skepticism and open contempt. Too slow in a turn, too wide to thread through the kind of low-altitude maneuvering that Pacific combat demanded. Too heavy, designed for Europe, where the fighting happened at 30,000 feet against German aircraft. The Japanese flew light, nimble fighters. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar could turn inside almost anything flying. In a turning fight at low altitude, a P-47 was at a disadvantage. Kirby did not argue with any of that. What he argued was that the P-38 pilots were framing the problem wrong. A turning fight at low altitude was not the fight he intended to have. His proposition: take the P-47 to 28,000 feet, above the altitude where Japanese fighters operated most efficiently. Cruise there. Watch the fight below. When the moment comes, push the nose over. Let gravity do the work. At more than 400 miles per hour in a sustained dive, with 8 50 caliber machine guns in the wings and nearly 8 tons of aircraft behind them. The P-47 hit with an impact that had no tactical counter in the Japanese inventory. You did not need to outturn the enemy. You needed to be above him, fast, and gone before he could recover. He trained his group in those tactics from the moment they arrived. The P-38 pilots watched from across the flight line. They were not persuaded. The specific objection was this: in the Southwest Pacific, combat rarely happened at 28,000 feet. Japanese aircraft operated most effectively at lower altitudes. The P-47's climb rate was poor. It took time and fuel to get up to altitude, time during which an escort formation might already be engaged. And if a P-47 pilot used up his altitude advantage on a first pass, and the attack didn't finish the job. He was now at low altitude, in a slow, heavy aircraft trying to maneuver against an Oscar that could turn inside him. The P-38 pilots had seen what happened to heavy aircraft that ended up in turning fights with Japanese fighters. They had seen it enough times that their skepticism about the P-47 was not unfounded. Kirby's counter to that was tactical discipline. His pilots were not going to get into turning fights. That was the rule. You dove, you fired, you climbed back out. If the attack didn't kill on the first pass, you climbed, reset, dove again. You never stayed at low altitude long enough to let the Oscar use its advantages. The P-47's weakness in a turn was only a weakness if you let the fight become a turning fight. His job was to make sure it never did. There are stories, not officially documented, but passed around among the pilots in the theater, that at some point Kirby took a P-47 up against Richard Bong's P-38 in an informal test, to settle the argument in the air the way fighter pilots preferred to settle arguments. No official record of that engagement exists. What is documented is that by September 1943, the 348th's kill ratio had become difficult for anyone to dismiss. On September 4th, 1943, Kirby opened his own account. A Mitsubishi G-4M bomber and a K-43 Escort, both confirmed. The dive, the guns, the pullout. He filed the report the way a man files a report when he has been right about something and does not feel the need to say so. He named his aircraft Fiery Ginger, Virginia's nickname. He put it on the cowling in painted letters. When that P-47 was cycled out and replaced, the next one got the same name, Fiery Ginger 2, then 3. The name was the constant thing. The aircraft underneath it changed, the way the work changed, the way the sky changed. The name stayed. In the first week of August 1943, 2 weeks before Kenny's bombers went to work on the 4th Air Army at Wewak, Kirby's older brother died. Major John Gallatin Kirby III was 37 years old. He was not a combat pilot. He was a project manager at Wright Field, Ohio, overseeing the development of high-altitude pressure suits, experimental equipment designed to keep pilots alive above 50,000 feet. He had set a record in an altitude chamber the previous year, simulating 60,200 feet. He was working on something that would eventually become the foundation of the modern space suit. Time magazine would mention his name, posthumously, in 1945. He died in a plane crash in Charlevoix, Michigan, on August 2nd, 1943. Neil Kirby did not stop flying. There is no record of what he said about his brother's death. There is the flight log. It continues. October 11th, 1943. Most of the 348th Fighter Group's pilots are flying escort runs to Nadzab that morning. Routine work. Kirby looks at the weather. Clear sky. Good visibility, and decides the conditions are right for something else. A free-roving patrol to the west, over Wewak. He takes 3 men with him. Captain John Moore, his operations officer, who was not scheduled for any mission that day and volunteered. Major Raymond Gallagher, who commanded the 342nd Squadron. Captain Bill Dunham, flying wing for Gallagher. 4 P-47s depart Ward's Drome at 0930. They climb to 28,000 feet and turn west. The Wewak airfields had been hit hard in August. The 4th Air Army had been largely rebuilt since then. New aircraft ferried in from Japan. New pilots assigned to replace the ones lost. But the rebuilding had not been completed. And what Kirby had come to do was look, not attack. Reconnaissance. Mark the positions. Count the aircraft. Bring the intelligence home. They are 50 miles out from Wewak when he sees what is already in the air below him. 12 Japanese bombers, 36 fighters in close escort formation. A formation that large meant the 4th Air Army had recovered enough to put serious striking power back in the air. That was the intelligence Kenny needed. Kirby had it. The mission was complete. The needle on the fuel gauge had been dropping since they left Ward's drome. 48 Japanese aircraft stood between his formation and the nearest friendly field. He dropped his wing tanks. He gave the signal. The 4 Thunderbolts rolled over from 28,000 feet. What happens next takes less time to experience than it takes to describe. Speed builds fast in a sustained dive from that altitude. Past 350, past 400, past 420 miles per hour. The first Japanese fighter, a Ki-43 Oscar in the outer escort ring, takes Kirby's opening burst before the pilot appears to have registered that an attack is coming. The aircraft falls away. Kirby is already pulling up, repositioning, turning back in. A second Oscar. A third. He drives through the formation, pulls out below, climbs back into altitude. The dive and the speed and the 8 guns firing at once. The Japanese escort formation has no coherent answer for it as it happens, because nothing in their training has prepared them for an attack that arrives from directly above at those speeds. By the time a Japanese pilot has registered that Kirby is in the formation, Kirby is already gone, climbing back up to reset the next pass. He sees Gallagher with 2 Japanese fighters on his tail. He goes for both of them, takes the first one, takes the second. Then one more pass, a 6th aircraft breaking away from the outer edge of the formation, before he pulls into cloud cover and calls for the flight to regroup. 4 voices answer. All 4 P-47s are present. No one is wounded. No aircraft has taken damage. The engagement, from first diving attack to the moment Kirby pulled into the clouds, happened within the hour. He leads them south. 6 Japanese aircraft confirmed by Kirby's gun camera. 3 more confirmed by the other pilots. 9 total for 4 Thunderbolts, against a formation of 48, with no American losses. When Kenny received the debrief, he recommended the Medal of Honor the same afternoon. He had seen a great many things in the Pacific War by October 1943. What Kirby had done that morning was, in his assessment, something specific and unrepeatable. The combination of tactical clarity and the particular kind of nerve that could see 12-to-1 odds and conclude that those were workable numbers. MacArthur approved the recommendation without delay. On January 23, 1944, in Brisbane, Australia, Douglas MacArthur stood in front of Neil Kirby and pinned the Medal of Honor on his chest. Kirby was the first Army Air Forces fighter pilot to receive the Medal of Honor in the Pacific Theater. If you've watched this far, and you believe a man like this deserves to be remembered, hit that like button before you keep going. It costs you nothing. For a story this far outside the history books, it means everything. The Japanese pilots who had been in that sky on October 11th did not know, until the war was over, what had come down on them that morning. The gun camera footage shows aircraft falling before their pilots appear to have had time to respond. A dive from 28,000 feet at that speed gives the target approximately 2 seconds between the moment the attack registers and the moment of impact. The Ki-43 escort had no answer for it on October 11th. They would find one eventually. They just hadn't found it yet. In November 1943, with 12 confirmed kills and the most famous name in the 5th Air Force, Neil Kirby was transferred to headquarters. 5th Air Force Fighter Command, administrative duties, a desk. Kenny made the transfer. The reasoning between the 2 men didn't require a memo. The leading ace in the theater, a Medal of Honor recipient, a man whose name was appearing in newspapers back home. You did not lose that man over New Guinea if you could prevent it. There was a public affairs calculation involved, and Kenny was not naive about it. There was also something simpler. Kenny had been watching Kirby since the man arrived in Australia. He knew what he was working with. He had seen it go wrong before. He gave Kirby terms: 2 combat missions per week, maximum. If he scored a kill on any mission, he was to break off immediately and come home. No additional passes, no confirmation circles, score and leave. Every time Kenny stated the rule, Kirby agreed to it. He flew on his first permitted day. He flew on every permitted day after that. By early 1944, Richard Bong and Thomas Lynch, both P-38 pilots, both with longer combat records than Kirby, were within reach of Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I American record of 26 aerial victories. The number followed every pilot in the 5th Air Force the way certain numbers do, as a standard, as a ceiling, as the thing that defined whether a man had done something that would outlast the war. Kirby was at 18, then 19, on January 9th, on one of his permitted missions. He scored a double, kills 20 and 21, and came home tied with Bong for the theater lead. He filed the report the way he filed all of them. He did not celebrate visibly. The record stood at 22 when Kirby walked out to Fiery Ginger IV on the afternoon of March 5, 1944. He was taking a combat patrol with Captain Bill Dunham and Major Samuel Blair. They were heading toward the Tadji area. Over Wewak, the same airfields, the same sky, they spotted 3 Kawasaki Ki 48 bombers from the 208th Sentai approaching Dagwa Airfield. Kirby attacked the lead aircraft. He fired. He watched. He could not confirm the kill. Here is where the mission turns. Every rule Kenny had given him said the same thing. If you score, go home. Don't wait for confirmation. The gun cameras will show it later. Come home. Every rule Kirby had built into his own tactics said the same thing. Maintain speed. Maintain altitude. Never give up what the dive gave you by turning back into the fight. He made one complete circle. One full turn. Back toward the target. Back into the airspace where the bombers had been. To get eyes on the aircraft he had hit and confirm whether it was going down. Speed bleeds fast in a turn. The laws of physics do not make exceptions for Medal of Honor recipients. A Ki-43 from the 77th Sentai, one of the types he had torn through 5 months earlier over this same coast, moved into position behind him during that circle. Dunham saw it. He went for it. He shot it down. He was a fraction of a second late. Kirby's P-47 was already hit. The cockpit had taken fire. Fiery Ginger 4 went down into the jungle below. The villagers near Dagwa watched the parachute open. They watched the man come down. They watched the chute catch in the trees. According to the accounts gathered from those witnesses afterward, he was already wounded from the attack. Wounds from the cockpit. From the moment before the ejection. He was hanging in the harness. He was alive. And then, he was not. Dunham and Blair searched from the air. They flew patterns over the jungle, looking for a signal, looking for movement, looking for anything. They searched until the fuel situation made the decision for them. They turned south to Sidor. Neil Kirby was 32 years old. He had been flying combat missions over New Guinea for 6 months. He was carried as missing in action for 3 years. In 1947, a Royal Australian Air Force Graves search party went into the jungle near Dagwa, guided by the local people who remembered where they had buried the American pilot who had come down in the trees in March 1944. They found the wreck of Fiery Ginger 4. Serial number 42-22668, still readable on the airframe. Kirby's remains were nearby. The formal identification took until 1949. On July 23, 1949, Neil Kirby was buried at Hillcrest Memorial Park in Dallas, Texas. He was laid next to his older brother John. John Kirby had gone down in a plane crash in Charlevoix, Michigan, in August 1943, while Kenny's bombers were erasing the 4th Air Army at Wewak. Two brothers, taken by the war in the same season, by different means, in different places. They are buried in the same ground now. Virginia lived until 1989. She outlived her husband by 45 years. Their 3 sons, Robert, John, and Kenneth, all died in aircraft accidents after the war. Robert and Kenneth were killed together when their plane struck power lines over the Arkansas River near Keystone Dam. John died separately, in Texas, in 1977. The name Kirby had painted on 4 different aircraft did not protect the people it was meant for. It just outlasted them. The airframe of Fiery Ginger 4 is preserved today at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. His Medal of Honor is displayed alongside it. A full-scale replica of his P-47 stands in the exhibit. A building at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls carries his name. A statue stands outside the public library in Arlington, Texas, the city where he went to high school, where he was 13 years old when his father moved the family there. Before any of this was imaginable, Kenny gave Kirby one rule that mattered above all the others. When you score a kill, come home. Don't circle back. Don't wait for confirmation. Go. The film and the cameras will confirm it later. Your job is to be alive, to debrief. Kirby accepted that rule every time it was stated. On March 5, 1944, over Dagwa Airfield, over the same sky where he had built his name, he turned back into the fight to confirm a kill he wasn't sure of. That turn cost him his speed. His speed was the only thing that had kept him alive through 22 missions. He knew that. He had taught it to every pilot in his group. He turned back. There is no explanation for that which doesn't end up sounding like the same thing from a different angle. The man who had the clearest understanding of why the rule existed was the same man who broke it. Maybe that's what the accumulated weight of those missions does to a man's sense of what he can survive. Maybe it's what 48-4 odds, lived through once, does to his calculation of risk. That turn cost him everything, and the sky above Wewak, which had been his, stayed his. Japan never took it back. Your grandfather may have flown in a sky made safer by what happened at Wewak in August 1943. He may have run missions in the fall of 1944 and noticed that the Japanese air response was lighter than he expected. He may never have known why. He may never have known the name Neil Kirby, or the 5 days in August that turned the 4th Air Army into 30 aircraft, or the morning in October when 4 P-47s came down from 28,000 feet and 9 Japanese fighters didn't come home. He just came home. If his name deserves to be spoken out loud one more time, leave it in the comments. Where he served, one thing he said, one thing he never said, one moment that stayed with you from whatever pieces of his story he left behind. That's how these men survive what time is doing to the record.